Ever feel like you're just drowning in headlines? Trying to piece together what's really happening on the world stage. It can be, well, overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a lot.
That's the noise we want to cut through here on the deep dive.
Ah.
We take those stacks of info, those sources,
Mhm.
and pull out the key insights, to help understand what's truly going on.
And today we're tackling a really big one. The fundamental shifts in global power. We're seeing a real shakeup driven by this intense competition between major nations, big economic changes, and this constantly evolving web of alliances.
It really feels like things are moving fast.
They are. These are the forces reshaping the world as we know it, really.
Exactly. So we've been digging into a couple of key sources, just internally calling them new note and pasted text. And our goal, our mission for you in this deep dive is to give you a clear understanding of these major forces at play, particularly this move towards what's called multipolarity and how the big global players are reacting.
Right.
So let's jump right in. What exactly does this idea, multipolarity, what does it mean today?
Well, at its heart, multipolarity describes a situation where power is distributed. It's spread out among several significant countries or centers of power rather than being, concentrated in just one or two.
It's like the Cold War.
Exactly. Think back to the Cold War that was largely a bipolar system. You had the US and the Soviet Union sort of calling the shots. What we're seeing now is a much more dispersed landscape of influence.
Okay. And what's driving this shift? What are the main engines pushing us away from that older order?
Well, there are several key factors really pushing this. A primary one is definitely the relationship between the United States and China. The U.S. increasingly sees China not just as an economic competitor, which it has for a while, but now as a strategic one, someone aiming to, well, reshape the global order to its liking.
And China's perspective.
China, on the other hand, often frames its growth differently. They talk about a peaceful rise, pointing to things like the Belt and Road Initiative as examples of a cooperative approach.
Then, of course, you can't ignore the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's really sent ripples through everything, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Global economics, geopolitics.
Absolutely. Huge impact. The war triggered major shifts in energy supplies. You've got widespread economic sanctions and what some people are calling the weaponization of finance. It's forced a lot of nations to reassess their dependencies, their alliances, really think about where they stand.
It's also interesting. It feels like ideology, capitalism versus communism like the old days, isn't the only dividing line anymore. Material power, actual economic and military clout, seems to be taking center stage.
That's a really important point, yeah. While ideology hasn't vanished, of course, we are seeing a growing emphasis on tangible factors, like the redistribution of economic power.
Right.
Take China's GDP. If you adjust it for what things actually cost there, that's purchasing power parity or PPP, it's now actually surpassed the U.S.
Wow.
And what's really transformative isn't just the size, it's the model. China's state-directed capitalism is offering this alternative development path that seems to resonate with quite a few countries in the global south. Countries may be wary of the Western liberal economic approach.
And this is where it gets really interesting because you also have advancements in military tech playing a role, things like hypersonic weapons, the AUSU submarine deal we'll probably talk about later. And then these countries that were maybe more non-aligned historically, like India or Saudi Arabia, they seem to be seeking more strategic independence now, carving their own path.
Precisely. They're navigating this multipolar world by, well, prioritizing their own national interests. They're not just automatically lining up with one big power. And what's fascinating here is how different this is from the Cold War.
How so?
Well, think about the economic interdependence. We have this deep connection now, like the U.S.-China trade relationship is over $575 billion a year.
That's huge.
It is. That level of interconnectedness just didn't exist between the blocs back then. So decoupling, breaking up economically, it's really, really difficult.
And it's not just the superpowers either, right? You mentioned middle powers, regional blocs like ASEAN and Southeast Asia or the African Union. They seem resistant to picking sides, too.
Exactly right. They seem to be actively rejecting that binary, bloc versus bloc way of thinking. They'd rather maintain relationships with multiple partners. It makes sense for them.
Okay, so given this whole shifting landscape, how's the United States adapting? What's the strategy?
Well, it looks like the U.S. has pivoted towards something described as a multilateral containment strategy.
Multilateral containment.
Yeah, so instead of trying to contain powers like China all on its own unilaterally, the U.S. is increasingly working through its network of allies and partners. We see this in strengthening old alliances and building new ones.
Like the Quad, IUKS, and of course NATO still playing a big role.
Exactly, and these platforms are interesting because they combine both hard power, military deterrence with soft power tools. Things like vaccine diplomacy we saw, or initiatives for sharing technology.
But it's not all just about competition and containment, is it? It seems like there's still room for cooperation sometimes.
That's a crucial point, yeah. Despite the underlying strategic competition, which is definitely real, we do still see selective cooperation happening.
Like what?
Well, for example, the U.S. and China are still talking on climate change. That hasn't stopped. We saw those vital grain deals between Russia and Ukraine, even amidst the war. And groups like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others, they continue to evolve, offering diplomatic spaces even when tensions are high elsewhere.
Now, one region that keeps coming up again and again as a real focal point for all this, the Indo-Pacific. Why is that area so critical right now?
Oh, the Indo-Pacific is immensely important, just hugely significant for a number of reasons. First, you've got some of the world's most critical sea lanes running through there, essential for global trade.
Lifelines, really.
Absolutely. Plus, it has incredibly dynamic, lucrative markets. And just the sheer scale, it's home to a vast majority of the world's population and economic activity. The numbers are pretty staggering.
Whatever you talk about.
We're talking about roughly 64% of the global population lives there, and it generates over 62% of the world's GDP, all within about 44% of the Earth's surface area.
Wow, those are huge numbers. And I imagine it's also packed with military power.
You got it. 7 of the world's 10 largest armies are located in the Indo-Pacific. And unfortunately, it's also seen as a region with potential nuclear flashpoints. Ongoing tensions around Taiwan, North Korea, these are prime examples.
So really is the crucible where this U.S.-China geostrategic competition is playing out most intensely, each side trying to expand influence. Some people are even calling it a new Cold War.
That's a description you definitely hear. And it reflects that escalating intensity, diplomatic, political, economic competition heating up across the region. Now, maybe we should zoom in a bit on China's expanding global role specifically. It's hard to overstate the speed of their development.
Absolutely. I mean, since 2000, the progress China's made, economy, tech, military, even human development index, it's truly remarkable.
It is. They became the world's second largest economy back in 2010, and they've been pretty open about their ambition to potentially surpass the U.S. in the coming years.
Which, understandably, the U.S. sees as a challenge.
Right. A challenge to its long-standing global leadership, and particularly its promotion of that liberal economic model we talked about.
And it's not just economics, is it? The modernization of China's military and their capabilities. That's a big concern for U.S. security interests, too.
That's correct. The advancements in their military tech, their growing reach, definitely being watched very closely in Washington and other capitals. But beyond the hard power, China is also taking on a more prominent role in regional politics.
We saw that recently, didn't we? Brokering that deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That felt like a pretty significant diplomatic move.
It really was a major achievement, and it really highlighted China's growing diplomatic muscle, especially in the Middle East. Plus, they're actively working to boost connectivity across Asia and strengthen organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. That helps solidify their regional influence, too.
Okay, let's circle back quickly to the Russia-Ukraine war. We touched on its impact, but how exactly has it fueled this move towards multipolarity?
Well, like you said, the wars had profound impacts everywhere, economic, geopolitical, even cultural.
Right.
And one of the most significant consequences, as our sources really emphasize, is that it seems to have seriously accelerated this trend towards multipolarity. The war, in a way, kind of exposed the limits of a unipolar system, perhaps, and it's encouraged more countries to look for diverse partnerships, seek greater independence in their foreign policy.
Now, another crucial player in all this is the European Union. What's their game plan as they navigate this tricky rivalry between the U.S. and China?
It's definitely tricky for them. According to our sources, the EU's main goal seems to be achieving what they call strategic autonomy. Basically, trying to act more independently amidst this big power competition, but ideally without wrecking their relationship with the United States.
That sounds like a very delicate balancing act. especially since, you hear about different views within Europe itself on how to deal with China.
Precisely. It's not monolithic. Some EU nations prioritize those close U.S. ties, definitely. Others have really significant economic links with China they don't want to lose. This internal division makes it tough for the EU to have one single unified approach sometimes. And Washington definitely wants to keep a strong strategic foothold in Europe.
I remember seeing some interesting quotes in the material from European leaders about this exact point.
Yeah, there was that Charles de Gaulle quote, quite striking. It will not be any European statesman who will unite Europe. Europe will be united by Chinese. It really speaks to how external pressures can sometimes force unity. And French President Emmanuel Macron has stressed Europe's need to cut its dependencies, avoid becoming a vassal, as he put it, or getting caught up in a bloc versus bloc logic, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like Taiwan.
So what's the EU's actual strategy then for engaging with the Indo-Pacific specifically?
They laid out their strategy back in September 2021. It focuses on long-term engagement, things like trade, investment, boosting connectivity, tackling global challenges together like climate change. The idea is, despite the U.S.-China tensions, despite AUKUS and the Quad, the EU wants to help prevent conflict there and ensure freedom of navigation, keep things stable.
Okay. Now, another really significant piece of this whole global puzzle is the relationship between Russia and China. It seems to be getting much closer. How important are these Sino-Russian ties?
They've become increasingly strong, yeah. Especially framed against what both Moscow and Beijing see as U.S. efforts to contain them. Look at the trade numbers they've surged, hitting a staggering $240 billion. Russia's become a major petrochemical supplier to China now.
And it's not just trade, right? There's a military angle, too.
That's right. China's shown interest in Russian weapons, missile technology, presumably to help with its own military modernization. But beyond the practical stuff, they also share this vision, this common goal of a more multipolar world order, one where the global south, as they see it, has a bigger say.
It is quite striking, isn't it? Russia, historically so European, now increasingly looking east and positioning itself as a champion for the global south.
It's a notable shift, for sure. Their support for the Palestinian cause, for example, fits into that narrative. And remember, both Russia and China were founding members of the SKO and BRICS. Their kind of open-door policies for these groups suggest they want to build alternative frameworks, maybe challenge those dominated by the West.
And they back each other up on key issues.
Yeah, they offer mutual support. Russia consistently backs Beijing's One China policy on Taiwan, for instance, and China offers Russia diplomatic cover in other areas.
And how does the U.S. see this growing partnership? Predictably, I imagine.
Unsurprisingly, yeah. The United States views this deepening relationship as a pretty significant challenge, a threat even to what it calls the free and democratic world.
Okay. Now, another trend you mentioned that seems to be gaining steam is this push for de-dollarization. What's fueling that?
Well, it seems there's this growing unease, you could say, in various capitals, Moscow, Beijing, but others too, about just how dominant the U.S. dollar is in the global financial system, and crucially, the leverage that dominance gives the United States.
Right. The dollar's been king for a long time.
Exactly. Since the end of World War II, basically. The undisputed king of currencies. It's central to international trade, loans, global debt. Its status as the main reserve currency was cemented at Bretton Woods back in 1944. About half of all global debt is still denominated in dollars.
So just to be clear, what does de-dollarization actually mean in practice?
Good question. Essentially, it's the process where countries try to reduce how much they rely on the U.S. dollar as their main reserve currency, as the go-to currency for international deals, and as the standard for pricing stuff like oil and commodities.
And we're seeing actual examples of this happening.
We are. Things like countries agreeing to trade oil or other commodities using their own currencies or other currencies besides the dollar. Central banks reducing the percentage of dollars they hold in their foreign reserves, more bilateral trade deals settled in local currencies, and generally shifting investments away from dollar-denominated assets. It points towards a potentially significant shift in the global financial order down the line.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. How have things changed regionally, particularly after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, the U.S. withdrawal back in August 2021 definitely triggered some rapid, significant shifts, especially in South and East Asia. Because of their geostrategic locations, countries in that neighborhood are now playing even more central roles in this evolving environment.
And one country really in the thick of it is Pakistan, right? With the Taliban back in power next door.
That's right. The Taliban's return presented, well, both big challenges and maybe some opportunities for Pakistan. Our sources point to Pakistan being quite active in the Afghan peace process afterwards. Diplomatic efforts trying to get the West to maybe soften its stance on the Taliban, organizing OIC summits, that's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to get funds and support for Afghanistan, and also trying to persuade the Taliban to meet international commitments to gain recognition.
Okay. Another long-running issue, always simmering, always a potential flashpoint, Taiwan. Can you just give us the brief historical context there?
Sure. Historically, Taiwan's got a complex past. Ruled by Chinese dynasties, then under Japanese rule for about 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. After World War II, it was surrendered to the Republic of China.
And Beijing's current view?
Beijing views Taiwan as a breakaway province. It insists it must be reunified with the mainland and hasn't ruled out using force to achieve that. It's a core issue for them.
Okay, now let's talk about some of these newer security pacts. AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. That certainly made waves when it was announced.
It absolutely did. China reacted very strongly, called it destabilizing, said it undermined regional peace, intensified the arms race, accused it of reflecting a Cold War mentality.
Others were critical, too.
Yeah, North Korea, Malaysia also voiced criticism, worrying about an arms race.
But the U.S. perspective, obviously, is different.
Completely. The Biden administration made it very clear they intend to challenge China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. They don't want it to be an uncontested space. So AUKUS is seen as a key part of that strategy, especially after pulling out of Afghanistan. Some analysts do warn, though, that AUKUS itself could fuel a pernicious cycle of the Cold War.
And how did other countries in the region react? It seems mixed.
It was mixed. India and Japan, who are also in the Quad, they welcomed AUKUS, saw it as a sign of U.S. commitment, even though they weren't part of the deal itself. Malaysia and Indonesia, though, expressed concern about, you guessed it, an arms race. Singapore took a more neutral position, and North Korea, well, they condemned it and used it as justification for continuing their own nuclear program.
And speaking of the Quad, U.S., India, Australia, Japan, that seems to be evolving too, from something fairly informal to more structured.
Yes, exactly. The Quad, or Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, has definitely become more institutionalized. It's addressing a wider range of challenges now, not just pure security. That summit President Biden hosted in September 2021 was a big step in strengthening the alliance. Some people even talk about it potentially becoming a sort of Pacific counterpart to NATO, though, it's still much earlier stages.
So wrapping all this up, looking ahead, what's the main takeaway from all these massive shifts and competitions we've talked about?
Well, a key point from our sources is the critical need for global governance institutions, the ones we have, and maybe new ones too, to adapt. They need to make space for these rising powers. If they don't, the worry is we could end up in a more fragmented and, frankly, more dangerous world. Ultimately, the perspective presented is that U.S. actions in Europe and in Asia are seen as a primary driver behind this tightening China-Russia strategic partnership. And this partnership, which is multidimensional, really has the potential to reshape the international order, moving it away from the U.S.-led system we've known for decades.
And the final thought is?
The final thought is pretty clear. Provocative actions, whether from the U.S., China, or Russia, really aren't in anyone's best interest if the goal is global peace, progress, prosperity, and stability.
Right. So just to quickly recap for everyone, we've seen this definite, significant shift towards multipolarity. Power is more spread out now. The Indo-Pacific is clearly a central stage for intense competition. We're seeing alliances form and evolve as countries try to figure out this new landscape. And underneath it all are these fundamental changes in economic power and strategic priorities.
That sums it up well.
It's an incredibly complex picture, isn't it? So much more interconnected, more fluid, maybe, than those older power struggles. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What are the implications of all this for global stability? Where are the potential flashpoints we really need to watch? But also, maybe where could we see cooperation emerge in the coming years?
Good questions.
And what role will different actors play? Not just nations, but maybe non-state groups, even individuals, in shaping whatever this evolving world order turns out to be. Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.